Every year, £1.25 billion is stolen from the NHS. That's money meant for doctors and nurses to run hospitals and to help us all when we fall ill. We're on the hunt with the crack teams of investigators.
This is a huge theft on a grand scale.
The treatment that he received hadn't happened. This is a fraud.
Tracking down the fraudsters, stealing public money.
They actually talk about, is what we're doing fraud? We are the villains, aren't we?
Locking them up and getting the cash back where it belongs.
Just under £1.5 million is going to be paid to some of the victims in our case.
Just over £23,000 back into the public purse.
The fraud squad is on the case. Today, a student nurse lies and deceives to swindle thousands of pounds to splash out on plastic surgery and foreign holidays.
She denied everything. I felt that she wasn't being honest and truthful.
And a greedy group of highly trained and specialist technicians care more about making an extra buck than their critically ill NHS patients.
This was actually set up from the start as a fraud in which they never intended to do their full contracted hours, and it was just purely a way of them to make money from the NHS.
The NHS, born in 1948 out of an ideal that good healthcare should be available to us all, regardless of wealth. 70 years on, and it's now the largest publicly funded healthcare system in the world, employing over 1.5 million people. Most have a passion to help and care, but there are others who want to steal and cheat. A hospital worker has stolen over £1 million worth of surgical equipment, vital tools desperately needed to save lives. The 39-year-old flogs the kits online and uses the profits to travel the world. NHS Fraud Investigation Manager Scott Fraser is in charge of the case and committed to bringing the thief to justice.
We were shocked to find that it wasn't 44 sets, it was actually 134 sets of surgical equipment that were missing. We were now looking at a replacement value of well over £1 million.
At a hospital in Ayrshire, a cancer patient has their operation cancelled at the last minute. The vital medical equipment needed has mysteriously gone missing. The local counter-fraud squad is called in.
Initially it sounded like a distribution issue, that the items potentially were there. But when we started looking at it in more depth, this was more than just 1 or 2 items unaccounted for. And that meant that we really needed to start investigating this in far more detail.
Scott joined the Counter-Fraud Authority 14 years ago.
Yeah, I've been in law enforcement, various guises, for over 30 years now, so my past work experience stands me in good stead for this role.
And he'll need to use all his skills if he has any chance of cracking this case. Scott's initial task is to identify exactly what is going missing, and at first glance, it looks like it's specialist surgical trays.
They're essentially trays that surgeons will use during operations.
The trays hold all the equipment the surgeon will need and are tailored specifically for each procedure. Scott's next step is to work out just how many have disappeared.
So actually drilling down a little bit deeper to find out exactly how many there are in circulation and where they are will soon give us an idea of the potential scope for a case like this.
It appears over 40 sets of surgical trays have gone missing, at a cost of between £10,000 to £14,000 each. This amounts to over £500,000 worth of equipment.
These items are not cheap, they're funded by the NHS. It's NHS money.
Scott is on a mission to discover how thousands of pounds worth of life-saving equipment is disappearing, putting lives at risk and robbing the NHS of much-needed cash.
We'd done some initial work on 2 or 3 of the surgical sets and followed them through the system. That got us started on the investigation, but even at that point we were starting to get more evidence in that there possibly was more missing. Obviously the health board and us were concerned about the lack of surgical equipment available for operations, and that did have an impact.
With the concern that more operations may be put at risk, Scott urgently needs to find out how these items are vanishing. He carries out an audit to work out exactly how many have gone already. The result is alarming.
We were shocked to find that it wasn't 44 sets, it was actually 134 sets of surgical equipment that were missing.
The total value of the lost equipment is now nearly £1.3 million.
There really was an onus on us at that point to say we now need to act quickly.
Scott wastes no time in tracking the sets through the system, using their unique serial number in the hope of finding the exact location in the hospital from where they're disappearing. The results hone in on one location.
On all occasions took us back to the decontamination centre.
This is a unit where all medical equipment is cleaned and sterilised before being returned to the hospital. It's a large place with more than 100 people working at the unit, every one of them with access to those surgical items.
And that's really quite a large sphere of people to try and track and narrow down the specific time and place that the items were being stolen.
Scott and his team cross-checked dates, times and people on duty against when the items were disappearing. One person's name keeps coming up.
My first thought was, we've made a mistake or that the records were incorrect. This was too good to be true. It couldn't all point to one person. So there was a little bit of suspicion about the figures and what the evidence was telling us.
The team checked the data, but the same name keeps popping up. Later, the fraudster and the true scale of the fraud is revealed.
It's clear that these items have been sent all over the world. The picture that was forming now is that this is not just a small theft. This is a huge theft on a grand scale.
The NHS Counter-Fraud Authority leads the way on dealing with and tackling fraud. Heading up in England is Sue Frith.
I think fraud against the NHS is despicable. We have a limited budget in the NHS. We all know that it's under pressure. But if criminals are taking money out of the system, then it affects us all. So that really motivates me.
A nationwide team of investigators have put more than £4 million back into the NHS.
I love this job. Knowing that we're stopping money going out the health service, or where we're finding it, we're actually doing something about it and able to bring people who defraud the NHS to justice is a really satisfying feeling.
NHS fraud, as far as I'm concerned, is a theft from every single person in this country, including me.
Our health service costs us around £126 billion a year. It's a massive amount of money that needs to be looked after.
We investigate fraud in the NHS without fear or favour.
There is a local and national counter-fraud response who are looking for you to see if you have committed fraud, and if we find you, we will bring you to justice.
Everyone has a hospital story, and it usually revolves around the amazing nurses that care for you. For me, it was when my father fell ill, and my family and I spent a lot of time in and out of hospital. The kindness, the generosity, the compassion of the NHS staff made what was a very difficult time more bearable. However, for our next case, we have a trainee nurse who's more Cruella de Vil than Florence Nightingale. Meet 41-year-old Tammy Gunter, who dishonestly claims tax credits and numerous grants and bursaries, ultimately swindling the NHS and Treasury out of £80,000. She splashes the cash on cosmetic surgery, designer handbags and jewellery, and a plush holiday home.
We just didn't know what we were going to find next. It was just mushrooming out, and it was probably one of the biggest cases I've had to deal with.
Today, Tammy Gunter arrives at Merthyr Tydfil Crown Court, hidden in a prison van. This is the final day of a drawn-out 3-year investigation led by Craig Greenstock. He hopes to recoup thousands of pounds from Miss Gunter and put it back into where it came from, the NHS.
Hopefully, as part of today's hearing, the money can be reclaimed from Tammy Ann Gunter. However, if she does not have the full amount of assets, then it is down to the court and to the judge then to determine how much she should pay, or if she can't pay, then whether or not then she should have a longer prison sentence.
Tammy Gunter lives in Blackwood, South Wales, with her 2 children. As her family are growing up, she's decided to train as a nurse. Along with the course application, she also applies for a bursary and grant to the NHS Student Finance Awards Unit.
She had to detail her personal circumstances, whether she was married, separated or divorced, whether she had any dependent children.
Tammy puts down she's single and has 2 dependent children.
She had to sign to say that it was truthful, honest and accurate.
Her application is successful. She's awarded a bursary of £1,000, a grant of nearly £8,000, and her course fees for the academic year are paid at a cost of £7,350, totalling over £16,000. Tammy starts her nurse training, and each month bursary payments are made into her bank account. 3 months later, out of the blue, Craig receives an email about Miss Gunter from one of the local authorities.
They indicated they'd been investigating a lady by the name of Tammy Gunter for the previous 3 years for allegations of fraud committed against Student Finance Wales by submitting misleading information in relation to her marital status.
Craig is on a mission to find out more. He emails Miss Gunter requesting copies of her bank and credit card statements, plus utility bills.
She refused initially to give me the details and asked me why I needed them. She felt that I was intruding into her personal business and that I had no right to ask for them.
Craig perseveres, and reluctantly, she gives in.
I wasn't looking into sort of where she spent her money. What I was looking at is whether or not her income then matched her expenditure. And if that was the case, then there wouldn't have been a problem.
Craig has only just started when something on her bank statement catches his eye. Tammy Gunter is also known as Tammy Hart.
To identify that she did have 2 names, she used the name of Tammy Gunter on all dealings that she had with local authorities, with the NHS and any public body. However, her bank account details were in Tammy Hart.
So who's Tammy Hart? Is this a pseudonym, or is she married? It doesn't take long for Craig to find out the shocking truth. She got married in 2009 to a man called Neil Hart. Craig immediately confronts Tammy Gunter. She sticks to her story, vehemently denying she's married. She says she's separated from her husband and she can prove it.
She provided a letter that she claimed was from the tax credits of HMRC, which detailed that she'd got married in 2009, but then separated from Neil Hart, and that she no longer lived with him and she was no longer in contact with him. That letter was later proved to be false and fraudulent because the local authority contacted the tax credits office and had confirmation from them that the letter was indeed false.
9 months into the investigation, Craig feels he has enough evidence to arrest Miss Gunter and search her property.
It was around about 6:30 in the morning. She was at the premises. The police went in first, informed her as to why we were there. They then arrested her and then took her into custody.
Craig, his team and the police searched the property for hours.
We found a staggering amount of information. She was an investigator's dream. She kept every single bit of paper, including documentation from going back to 1997. We took boxes and boxes of documentary evidence from that property.
The upstairs of the house is in Aladdin's cave.
And there was over £3,000 in cash, which is found in the property. Designer clothes, handbags, etc. The items of jewellery included Gucci, Pandora, Rolex watches, etc. We spent 2 hours in the property just going through everything, and it was just escalating.
The luxurious items and expensive jewellery didn't match the lifestyle Tammy Gunter was portraying. That of a single mother surviving on a trainee nurse's grant and tax credits.
Everything we found just seemed to confirm our beliefs that her and her husband were together and he was funding her lifestyle.
Questions need to be asked. If Miss Gunter is married, she could be guilty of not only ripping off the NHS, but also the public purse by fraudulently claiming tax credits.
We interviewed her initially in relation to what we believed and regards to the false documentation that she provided to the local authority. She denied everything.
Including being married to Neil Hart.
She still claimed that she was separated from him, that he didn't pay any of her bills. They'd separated shortly after they got married. I felt that she wasn't being honest and truthful with herself.
Craig's determined to find out the true facts behind the Hart's relationship. He brings Tammy's husband in for questioning.
He gave a prepared statement on the basis that he knew Tammy Gunter, they'd been in a relationship, they got married in 2009, he bought her gifts as and when, they weren't together, and he doesn't pay anything towards her household bills. And he refused then to answer any questions. He no commented then for the rest of the interview.
Undeterred, Craig cracks on.
My next job then was to go through all the evidence together with members of my team, looking at whether or not there was anything in those papers that could prove that Tammy Gunter and Neil Hart were together.
For the next 3 months, Craig and his team scour every document taken from Tammy and Neil Hart, determined to find a clue to prove the couple are still happily married.
In here we have some of the evidence that were used as part of the case. This document shows a finance agreement between Tammy Gunter and Neil Hart for the joint ownership of a timeshare property to the value of nearly $30,000. It shows quite clearly that they were together in 2011.
There was also documents then relating to car purchases on his name, but then the registrations then were in Tammy's name, together with her personalised number plates as well.
These were various cards that were seized. Inside it says, "To Neil, happy anniversary, first of many I hope, love you loads, Tammy." Their first wedding anniversary would have been June 2010. They split up, according to Tammy and to Neil, in 2009 December. This would have been some 6 months after.
We just didn't know what we were going to find next. It was just mushrooming out. We just didn't know where this was going to end.
Definitely no time soon, as every box is full of new revelations confirming their marriage.
She'd attended private clinics in Eastern Europe, and she received then cosmetic surgery to the value of over £14,500, for which was paid on Neil Hart's credit cards. For me, that could prove that they were in a relationship together, that he was maintaining the household by paying for much of those luxuries.
It was clear Tammy Gunter was living the high life thanks to her husband, but also from unlawfully claiming over £80,000 from the NHS and in tax credits. Money that should be for those who really need it.
And it was probably one of the biggest cases I've had to deal with regards to not only documentary evidence, but value.
The case goes to Merthyr Tydfil Crown Court. They both plead guilty. Tammy Gunter is sentenced to 2 years at Her Majesty's pleasure. Neil Hart, 6 months. It's 7 months since Tammy Gunter's sentencing. She remains behind bars. Craig is at Merthyr Tydfil Crown Court, where the judge has just made his decision on how much money the devious trainee nurse should pay back to the NHS and the Treasury.
The conclusion of the case today was that Tammy Gunter is to repay just over £23,000 back into the public purse. After all the effort and the time that we've put into investigating this case, yes, it is a good result. We recovered the sum of money, in total £9,500 back to the NHS, with another sum of approximately £14,000 then to go back into the public purse. And if Tammy Gunter ever comes into any money, or she is fortunate to win the lottery or sell a house, whichever, she then still has to pay the balance of that. It still remains on file.
Our next case is truly shocking. An internationally renowned heart and lung expert abuses his position to cheat the NHS out of £1 million. Whilst happily getting paid for his full-time NHS contract, he devises a way to cash in as he moonlights on NHS time. With operations cancelled, lives are put at risk. Basildon University Hospital, Essex. A tip-off to the local counter-fraud authority suggests that a team of perfusionists at the hospital are not completing their NHS hours and instead are using that time to work for lucrative private contracts elsewhere. Investigator Gavin Heaton is brought in. He'll need to draw on all of his 25 years of experience to crack this case.
When I first got to the case, I was a bit sceptical because I could imagine 1 or 2 people being involved in a conspiracy, but I couldn't quite see that a large part of the team at least would be involved in a conspiracy on this scale.
This looks to be no ordinary case. To get the true picture, Gavin needs to speak to everybody who works in the perfusionist unit. But that was going to be easier said than done.
At that stage, we had no idea who was involved, who wasn't. And the people that we wanted to ask were the ones that we suspected of being involved. So it was a self-contained unit and it was very hard to make initial inquiries. Very limited on who we could approach and we didn't know how far it went up.
Not wanting to attract attention amongst the perfusionists, Gavin starts by trying to work out when the team had actually been at the unit, with the help of a local counter-fraud investigator.
So he looked at things like car park records, car park barrier, swipe cards for getting into the building, and he compared those with the staff attendance. You could very quickly see that some people were there all the time and others were never there. So we had enough there to see that there was a case worth investigating.
With a team made up of 11 perfusionists, Gavin needs to look at each of them individually. He decides to start at the top with head clinician John Mulholland.
He was brought in to set up the NHS unit at Basildon and to decide exactly how much resources it needed, how many staff it needed.
Mulholland is employed full-time at Basildon to oversee the perfusion unit, where he's paid around £46,000 a year. Receiving significantly more than the national average, Mulholland should be content with what he has. But as Gavin continues to dig, he discovers that Mulholland has his own company called London Perfusion Science Limited. And on the board of that company are other full-time Basildon NHS staff. But the most alarming fact is that the company appears to be providing full-time perfusionists for other NHS hospitals, perfusionists who are already employed full-time at Basildon.
We established a John Mulholland and 3 of the members of staff at Basildon were sole directors of a perfusion company that were providing the contract to provide perfusion services at Hammersmith and St Mary's Hospital. So it was imperative we got over there and investigated.
But they couldn't have predicted what's waiting for them.
When we visited Hammersmith Hospital, there was this on the wall, and surprisingly it shows pretty much all the staff that we were investigating at Basildon, who were meant to be full-time employees there, apparently making up the perfusion team at Hammersmith as well, all dressed up as pirates, quite fittingly. I thought when I saw this was just how brazen they were about the fraud they were carrying out. You had basically 2 full-time jobs at 2 different sites.
It appears the 4 full-time Basildon employees are moonlighting at other hospitals, and it seems nothing will come between these pirates and their treasure as they put lives at risk.
And they were quite happy to force the unit to cancel cases so that they could do their private work elsewhere.
As the case continues to unfold and Gavin speaks to more staff at the unit, a darker side to Mulholland appears.
A member of staff told me that if Mulholland found out that they were the one that were talking to us and giving us evidence, they would never work again in that field, not only in England but in Europe. He said his influence was that strong and that was what they were putting at risk.
The true extent of the fraud is still unknown, but one thing that is clear is that the ringleader is John Mulholland. There's only one thing for it: to call the police.
We arrived here with officers from Essex Police and we went to the Cardiothoracic Centre over the back there. We were unannounced. We knew that there were no operations scheduled. Only him and one other member of staff was present. And I think his first reaction was, "Oh, you know what this is about, don't you?" So he didn't seem entirely shocked.
John Mulholland is arrested and taken to Basildon Police Station for interview.
It was a long account. Basically, a lot of management speak, a lot of we didn't understand perfusion, we didn't know what we was talking about, and in fact everything he was doing was all above board, and the NHS were benefiting from the way he was running things. He had a mugshot taken that evening. He seems to be smirking in it. I think it really sums up his character, because there he was under arrest for a very serious crime and he was just, you know, making out that it didn't bother him at all and he was laughing. Just shows his arrogance.
Later, the investigation falters as more arrests are made, but no one's talking.
Basically, John Mulholland told them exactly what they were going to say, what they were not going to say, how they were going to account for their lack of hours at the hospital. It just shows you, I think, the influence that John Mulholland had on these people.
What is it that helps motivate investigators to crack these cases?
The NHS is very important to me. When I was younger, my brother and I were involved in a car crash. We were both hit as pedestrians by a car. I was all right with a broken leg and a bad head, but my brother was particularly poorly. So the fact that the NHS were there to support him through a period of time in intensive care makes me very appreciative of the service that we have available to us.
When I was younger, I played a lot of sport, mainly football and cricket. And as a result, I had various injuries. The treatment that I had and the care that I had was very good.
My daughter was born, later discovered that she had scoliosis, which is curvature of the spine. So she had to go into St Kitts in Edinburgh for an operation. It's a very successful operation and she's going to live a great life.
It is there caring for people from cradle to grave. I have children, I have ageing parents. The care they receive from the people who are working in the NHS is astounding.
I had a major heart operation a few years ago and I would be dead without the NHS.
Over £1 million worth of equipment has been stolen from a hospital in Ayrshire. Scott Fraser, a fraud investigation manager, is on the case and closing in on one potential suspect. A man named Daniel Dreghorn.
More and more of them were coming up with Daniel Dreghorn as being the only person on duty and receiving those particular items.
39-year-old Daniel Dreghorn has worked at Ayrshire Central Hospital since 1997.
Daniel Dreghorn worked his way up through the NHS and he actually became a very well-respected supervisor within the decontamination unit. Making sure that this equipment is sterilised correctly is a vital role, and Daniel Dreghorn had a very important part within that process. Once the surgical equipment had been used in surgery, it was then returned to the decontamination centre to be sterilised. At that location, Daniel Dreghorn would be the first person to receive these goods.
Daniel Dreghorn becomes the #1 suspect. But is it just a coincidence? Scott and his team need concrete evidence, and with the thefts continuing, they need to act fast.
The fact that we've got Daniel Dreghorn on duty on the half-dozen dates that the initial surgical items had been stolen, that was the catalyst for us to start saying we need to focus on that particular unit.
There's only one thing for it. The investigators, accompanied by the police, head to the decontamination centre to arrest Daniel Dreghorn.
The minute they walked in, Daniel Dreghorn said, "I know why you're here." He said he was glad it was all over. It was almost as if it was a relief to him that he'd been caught.
His work is searched. His home is searched, where they discover some disturbing pieces of evidence.
These are some of the items that were recovered from Daniel Dreghorn's home address. These are actually sticky labels that Daniel Dreghorn's created himself. We've got one here for Corona in the USA, and we've got a third one here for Hong Kong. So the minute we saw these documents that have been used on the packaging, it was clear that these items have been sent all over the world.
Further investigation quickly establishes the stolen goods are being shipped abroad using 2 delivery companies.
When the courier company sent us these invoices, we couldn't believe that these items were being sold on the black market. But when we look at this, knowing the value of the sets, what we have here is an invoice for 2 telescope sets. Now, we know these are in excess of £10,000 each. The picture that was forming now is that this is not just a small theft. This is a huge theft on a grand scale, with Daniel Dreghorn happy to sell to whoever, wherever they are in the world.
Also found during the raid was a large bag containing unit ID tags.
When he stole each item, he also took the unique identification tag for each of the trays and then kept them in a bag. So the searchers were astounded to see he'd almost kept trophies of every item that he'd stolen.
The counter-fraud squad are closing in on Daniel Dreghorn.
At the point we've concluded the search, we have Daniel Dreghorn admitting to stealing items. We also have some very incriminating evidence, but we still need to prove that Daniel Dreghorn actually stole these items.
Scott hopes Daniel Dreghorn's laptop and mobile phone may hold the key. The items are sent to Scott's colleagues in the forensic computing unit.
We've hoped that they can extract from those devices deleted files, things like emails or maybe invoices that have been created. Could we get them back? Who'd purchased them? What they'd paid for them? Anything that will provide us evidence in relation to the theft. We need to start narrowing that down.
If anyone can help, it's this man, Guy Linkletter. He's a forensic computing specialist and has been cracking codes and deciphering data for over 15 years.
The first item we received was the laptop. Photographs were taken, date and time, information was taken from the BIOS, the hard drive was removed.
All the data from Daniel Dreghorn's laptop and other devices are now on Guy's computer. He can start to analyse it.
And it's conversations between Danny Dreghorn and someone in this instance saying, please let me know if you want a deal as soon as you can. The response coming back is saying, I'm interested in the kits. If they're good for a price, how much for all of the sets? I have 2 of all kits. I will do them all if you can pay today for $2,250. That's a great deal for you, my friend. Obviously, that makes you think that there's a relationship already. It's not a formal conversation that they seem to be having.
A lot of the investigation, obviously, it's all pointing at Daniel Dreghorn, but we still had to come back to that fundamental question. Can we prove that Daniel Dreghorn actually stole the items?
Scott goes back to Guy, who's found photos of the stolen equipment on Daniel Dreghorn's personal tablet. Could these photos finally nail the NHS employee?
The amount of data that is embedded within those photographs can be instrumental in establishing where a photograph was taken, when it was taken. So the image here that we have of the medical equipment, there's some information across the left-hand side here. Not only does it tell us the camera make and model, it tells us the date and time, but what it also does is it gives us the location, the geolocation of the image when it was taken.
And 2 locations stand out.
Now, this is the hospital itself, a number of photographs taken there, and a number of photographs taken here, and this, I believe, is where Daniel Dreghorn lived.
This was the crucial piece of evidence that proved beyond all doubt that Daniel Dreghorn was the person that stole these devices.
But would he admit to it? He does. Daniel Dreghorn pleads guilty to the theft of 134 sets of surgical equipment, valued at £1.3 million. He's sentenced to 4 years in prison.
I think that sentence speaks for itself. It's a highly impactful sentence, and I think it sends a clear message that if you are going to steal from the NHS, you can expect sentences like this.
A tip-off from a Basildon Hospital employee leads investigators to arrest a world-renowned perfusionist, John Mulholland. It's believed he's the mastermind behind a £1 million fraud against the NHS. Unaware of how deep the scam goes, investigators interview the entire unit, but find Mulholland's influence on them to be too strong.
Straight away I got this feeling that there was people wanted to tell me stuff who were scared to.
Following his arrest, Mulholland's house is searched and his computer is seized.
That was the real turning point of the case. His work emails were, there was hardly anything on there. There were sort of like code names used for each other, nicknames and things like that. But he clearly never thought that he would ever get arrested and we would never search his home address because his home emails were full of information and evidence that was crucial. Some of the emails were very explicit into exactly what they were trying to do. They actually talk about, is what we're doing fraud, and we are the villains, aren't we? So there's no doubt at all.
Who would have thought such highly educated medical professionals could leave such an obvious paper trail?
I think my favourite is this one where it says, if I did convince them to put me up, they would want me to do more of the bleep, NHS bleep, that I would try to avoid unless it's going to make cash, make our lives easier. This is a perfect opportunity to give the impression that we all work here all the time. They were pretty much gold dust to the investigation.
As are the records that show the movements of the 3 other company directors.
This spreadsheet was put together for Tom Cumberland, and it shows you exactly where he was on certain days. And you can see from here that on these various dates he was at Basildon, King's College Hospital, Basildon, King's College Hospital. But then he comes down, he's at Hammersmith, King's College. And you can start to see that he's going into Basildon once a week, if that. Now here's a full-time employee who's meant to have a full-time job at Basildon, and yet most of the time he's spending more time at King's College Hospital.
So what these records ultimately were able to show was that the perfusion staff weren't doing their contracted hours. They were actually off working privately for this time.
The scale of this fraud against the NHS is becoming clear.
Now, this wasn't a case that involved NHS employees doing a bit of private work on the side on top of their NHS hours. This was actually set up from the start as a fraud in which they never intended to do their full contracted hours. And it was just purely a way of them to make money from the NHS.
After months of trying to convince the other company directors to talk, one of them finally does and provides Gavin with a disturbing revelation.
Straight after John Mulholland's arrest, he had arranged a secret meeting at a member of staff's house on a Sunday, and he'd told all the staff that they had to attend. I think there were 2 or 3 of these meetings in all. Basically, John Mulholland told them exactly what they were going to say, what they were not going to say, how they were going to account for their lack of hours at the hospital.
Convinced he's being lied to, Gavin brings them all back in for interview.
John Mulholland gave a very long account, again very much along the lines of, we didn't understand what we were talking about.
And it's clear that Mulholland's secret meetings have done the trick.
It was quite amusing when I was doing the interviews because they were word for word coming out with some of the same answers, which you would never get if it was a genuine answer they were giving.
The key to cracking the case is to convince one of Mulholland's minions to turn on their boss and tell the truth.
It was a big risk on their part, and we were relying on them not only to do the right thing and come forward, but also to have the courage to stand up in court and actually give evidence. I think they had to learn to trust us.
Eventually, Gavin succeeds. After 2 years of investigation, John Mulholland and the 3 other company directors face charges of conspiracy to defraud. It's believed that between them, they were paid for 14,000 hours of work that they simply didn't do. They all plead not guilty.
After a very long, drawn-out trial, I think it was 13 weeks in total, 4 of them were found guilty, were sentenced to terms of imprisonment. John Mulholland got 3 years, and Anne Clements, Tom Cumberland and Martin Oliver got 2 years each.
In closing, the judge described the fraud as a systematic, well-planned and executed deception, before finishing with, these offences were motivated purely by greed. For Gavin, the years of hard work pay off, and following a proceeds of crime hearing, £577,000 is returned to where it belongs, the NHS. 3 shocking cases, I'm sure you agree. But with your help, these despicable criminals can be brought to justice. The investigators are waiting for your call.
Fraud Squad NHS will be back at the same time tomorrow. Some investigations into investments next. Homes Under the Hammer coming up in just a moment.